we will get going with our next session. We have Dr. Scott Macdonald, who is with the Infotech Research Group, and so take it away. Thanks.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, I'll try to be as enthusiastic as possible, everyone. I realize we're all digesting our food and we're trying to wake up, so I'll keep things as entertaining as possible. I'm from Infotech Research Group. We're an IT advisory firm. I came down from Ontario in Canada to hang out with you folks here today. And I've been giving this keynote and delivering this message across, as I mentioned earlier, the West Coast, starting in California, moving up to Oregon, and finally with you folks over here. So I'm excited to have my first ACCIS. And there's really three key takeaways from this presentation. One is I want to confirm what you already know about your IT departments, but really give you the data to back it up. Secondly, I want to challenge some of the conventional thinking in IT, especially surrounding the metrics that you use to benchmark yourselves. And lastly, I want to provide you a new tool or framework or lens to kind of view your IT departments through. And I'd like to start off this presentation with a story. Who here knows this man? I think you had your hand up first. Who is he? And what is he famous for?
GM, athletics.
Yeah, and keep on going. One level deeper in the onion. What is he known for?
Everybody else was small, but
Boom, excellent. So he was the first guy in baseball to really build out an excellent team using data as to support this. He had around a third of the budget, around $40 million compared to his peers. And like many of you, he was challenged to do more with less. So I'll kind of set the stage. It was 2002, and Billy lost two of his best gloves, Johnny Damon and Jason Giamba, and he had a big gap to fill. But now he also had an opportunity to use data. So as the gentleman over there mentioned, he built out an excellent team, beat out the New York Yankees, Boston Red Sox consistently, and elevated them to that World Series level. So why am I talking about baseball? How does that actually relate to IT? Well, data is changing industries, as we saw earlier, and you need to use data to guide your decision-making in IT. So maybe I can ask you folks, what do you think IT's metric for success is? What's your version of on-base percentage? Just lift up your hand, and a one-word answer is suffice. But what's, come again?
it works.
It works? Sure, it works. Downtime? There we also good help desk. So I'll challenge your thinking on this. If you're doing those things good, are you making the business and the stakeholders happy, the city? And how do you know? So these things kind of roll up into our metric for IT success and how to get you folks into the World Series of IT. And our metric for success, our one metric to rule them all, is business satisfaction. Because ultimately, IT is there to serve the stakeholders and the business, the cities, the CIO. And depending on where you sit in this ladder of maturity, whether you're an unstable IT leader or someone who is a firefighter, your priorities are going to look very different depending on where you sit in this tower of maturity. But nonetheless, you need to use data to figure out where you are, where you want to go, and how you're going to get there. And there's three sources of data that we suggest looking at. One is something we call CIO business vision, which is just this jargon to say, ask the stakeholders. Start to benchmark your performance year over year. Get a prioritization of their projects and what they really want to see from you in terms of what you can knock out of the park. Then we suggest having a conversation between the most senior business leader and the most senior IT leader to make sure you agree on the current state of IT and where you think IT should be headed. And lastly, look internally. Look at the capabilities of your team. And to keep with the Yogi Berra, or not the Yogi Berra, but the baseball theme, I think it was Yogi Berra who said, if you don't know where you're going, you're going to end up someplace else. And this kind of data-driven thinking is going to help you end up where you want to go. So we've been running this kind of diagnostic over the last 6 years now, and we've pulled out some really cool insights. One of them is from polling over 380 pairs of CEO, CIO, or CAO, CIO, just those business and IT leader mix, and asking them, or assessing whether they see eye to eye in terms of the current state and target state of IT. And the results were interesting. In terms of the target state for IT, only 36% of the business leaders and the IT leaders agreed in terms of where IT should be aiming to be. And this was kind of alarming to us because there was only 5 options to pick from. We went back to that tower, and all they had to do was aim for a level on the tower in terms of where they thought IT should be in the next 1 to 3 years. And most of them were off. We said they were somewhat aligned if they were 1 level off, and highly misaligned if they were 2 levels off. And perhaps more alarming for us was the current state of IT, where you are now in this tower. Only 29% of the business leader and IT leader pairs were actually matched. And this is interesting because usually you only see symptoms of misalignments, and this kind of idea of misalignment is not something you typically measure formally. Usually you'll see symptoms like grumbling from the stakeholders of the company, finance, HR, the CIO, but you don't actually get to the root of it, which is an alignment in terms of the vision of IT. The next thing we wanted to figure out is how happy are we making the business today? So, simple question, we just asked in terms of a Likert scale, 1 to 10, 10 being very satisfied, 1 being not happy at all. We asked how happy are the stakeholders with IT? And maybe I'll just do an audience participation, just lift up your hand. Who thinks that your IT shop would currently be between a 10 to an 8? So they're very satisfied with the IT stakeholder level. 10 to an 8, so those are the all-stars. What about 8 to 6? Who sits between an 8 to 6? Excellent. And then 6 to 0, you can either half raise your hand. There's 1. Loud and proud, I like it. Well, in terms of the average, and I think this is consistent with a lot of people in this room here today, the stakeholders are ranking you at around a 7.3, which is a half pat on the back. It's not quite a full pat. But there's a long, steep slope to the left and a very steep drop-off to the right. And there's not a lot of IT leaders I meet with who get their result back and see a 7.3 and think, great, well, I've done my work. It's time to go hit the golf course. That's not usually the case. You want to really be an innovator, and you want to bring your city to the next, or your county or your state to the next level. You're there to succeed, and you're there to support the citizens. But how about over time? Has satisfaction with IT changed over time? We've done a lot of cool things in the last 4 or 5 years. Who thinks satisfaction with IT has gone up in the last 5 years? A few hands. What about gone the other way, gone down? A lot of angry stakeholders. What about flat? You, sir, are correct. It's remained, that's a successful table over there, actually. It's remained relatively flat, which is surprising because IT has done a lot of cool things over the last 5 years, and we've seen these in the talks here today. There's been a lot surrounding agile project management, cloud innovation, yet we're remaining relatively flat when it comes to stakeholder satisfaction. There was 1 data point that went up, marginally so, and this is how much the business now depends on IT. Year over year, the business depends more and more on IT. And this suggests that we're hitting a bit of moving targets. And it also suggests if you do the exact same thing you were doing last year, this gap's now going to increase. And this gap here between those 2 lines is what we're working to diminish. We want IT to reap the benefits of being innovative, and we want them to be able to support their stakeholders. So we know that business satisfaction is IT's 1 metric to rule them all. What drives business satisfaction? And maybe I'll pitch it out to the audience again. What do you think are what's the driver of business satisfaction in terms of what you do day to day?
Good communication.
Good communication kind of resonates with Michelle's talk earlier.
Basic uptime.
Basic uptime.
Responsiveness.
And if I was to ask you of those 3 answers, which was most important? And then how do you know for sure? That's the magic question. How do you know which one of these is the most important? And this has historically been a very big challenge for IT leaders. It's a hard question, but how do you know what drives business satisfaction? You need Ask the questions. Use the data. Data is your objective friend. It's always been my objective friend. In terms of the data we've collected, and again, this is just industry data. We always recommend to look internally, but this is what we see across our 42,000 stakeholders that we've polled. Project delivery and capacity carries 22% of the weight in terms of how happy you're making your stakeholders, which doesn't surprise anybody in the room. It's your ability to deliver projects on time and within budget. Number two, though, and I love that Michelle brought this up earlier, is relationships. This carries a fifth of the weight when it comes to how happy your stakeholders are. Your ability to communicate, execute on their needs is huge. And you'll notice one thing that's a bit, stands out here, and this is the budget piece. Relationships don't have a budget, and they don't really necessarily need a budget. It's something that comes a little bit for free, but it carries a fifth of the weight in terms of your stakeholder satisfaction. And you can compare that with some of the other things down the line. What does your applications bill look like currently, or your infrastructure bill? I guarantee that it's a lot greater than your relationship bill. But in 2018, the things that are driving the, at least generally speaking, the most satisfaction across all the IT shops we work with are those two things, project delivery and relationships. So again, this is just industry data. My pitch to you here today is to look internally, figure out what matters most to your stakeholders. And there's really 5 venues you can look across. One is just getting a pulse on the overall satisfaction of IT. So now that you have a number to work with, you can figure out how am I going to get this incremental 5 to 7 year-over-year improvements, starting from a number, and that you can just bring to your stakeholder meetings to show you've demonstrated that improvement. Then you can look across core IT services, satisfaction there, again, relationship satisfaction, questions surrounding resource constraints, IT dependency, and the fun topic of shadow IT. These are the kind of things that we suggest as to kind of unpack as you're developing these metrics. And what you can, visualize, or what you can generate from this, is a scorecard that now you can use as a communication platform to bring to your stakeholders. So you might have an individual one for the head of finance, individual one for HR, but now you're starting to really analyze things. On the left side is the very relationship-heavy content. So we have our overall satisfaction sitting around 73%, value in terms of an ROI perspective around 72. From a stakeholder standpoint, those are little stick figures. Every one of those guys is about 10% of the stakeholders for the cities or counties or states. Around half of the stakeholders are supporters of IT. They really enjoy them. Around 30% are the detractors. And it's interesting to ask these questions because it's not always very obvious that who's happy with you or who's not happy with you. When's the last time you got a high five for keeping the Wi-Fi on? It doesn't happen much, or it's hard to even kind of really visualize who's a detractor of IT. Sometimes it's obvious when Wi-Fi comes out and pitchforks and torches come and they start knocking at your door, but it's not always obvious. So it's good to ask these directed, pointed questions. Next, we have our relationship scores. On the right, this ties into that project piece. So here we have 12 core services across IT with the overall satisfaction of the people that we've polled. At the very top, we're doing pretty good in terms of what I'll call keeping the lights on IT, or traditional IT. So things like service desk, network infrastructure, these things have been around the longest. We've gotten very good at them. But then there's some newer things that are starting to creep in, such as analytical capability or innovation leadership. These are more so the sore spots across the IT departments that we work with. And from this data, we've pulled some pretty interesting insights. One of them, something that may have jumped out at you. I know the IT folks pay attention to this more than the business folks that I talk to, but things like requirements gathering is rated 12 out of 12 in terms of importance, which from like a project management standpoint just blows my mind. That doesn't make sense at all. So this suggested to us that maybe the business doesn't know what they want. We always kind of joke that stakeholders don't really, know what they want, but what if I told you that I have the data to back that up? On the left over here, this is the stakeholders' reported importance of what matters to them. So they said, we care about network infrastructure, we care about service desk. These are the top ones. Well, our question was, if we do these things and we're very good at them, are we actually making the stakeholders happy? And it turns out that the stakeholders don't know what they want. And in fact, it's almost a mirror flip. So now the traditional IT finds itself towards the bottom. These are just correlated with the overall metric. And things like project satisfaction, work orders, requirements gathering, surprise, surprise, now carry a lot of weight. These are the things that matter when you're making your IT strategy. And it's not to say don't do the things that are on the top left. In fact, we had a CIO when we gave this keynote in Louisiana who said I'd be kicked to the curb if I stopped supporting network infrastructure. I still need to do this. What we're saying is picture things in terms of Maslow's hierarchy. So that kind of pyramid where at the very top you have self-actualization, and at the very bottom you have physiological happiness, love, family, so on and so forth. And depending on where you sit in that scale, certain things are going to matter more. But you need to use data to figure out where you are in that hierarchy so you can figure out where to direct your time and attention. And what we find is that there's actually a threshold at which point everything before that threshold is held even in terms of satisfaction with core services. So before you hit the 72 to 75% threshold, whether you work on requirements gathering or business applications, they're going to yield similar dividends. All things are really held equal. But once you figure out where you sit in terms of your satisfaction with the business and core services, you can then start to prioritize things that are going to matter most to your stakeholders. So in this example, across the industry, once you pass that threshold of 72 to 75%, things like projects, work orders, business applications, and innovation leadership, these are going to be the areas that are going to provide the biggest bang for your buck. More so than things like devices and IT policies. And if you look at the data, that kind of makes sense. If you're a very mature organization, you don't need another security policy or suite. Your incident problem management security policies are probably in place. You don't need a third laptop. You don't need another device as a CIO. What you probably need is another project completed on time or within budget, or you need some support in the space of business applications. And again, we're not saying that business apps are more important than policies. We're saying use the data to figure that out. We're very big advocates on looking internally and moving a little away from benchmarks across your peers, which we do invest, yes.
Just one question. Do you know when you're presenting this data, what percentage of the respondents are coming from public sector versus private sector?
This is a mix, but we do. So we have industry-specific scorecards. My graphics team just didn't have the time to kind of slice them together, but this is across all the industries, but we do have the data on government, manufacturing, education, so on and so forth. Yeah, great question. Yeah, because it varies, of course, from industry to industry. And what we've done with this is we've come up with the formula for business satisfaction. It's very simple. It's a simple multiple linear regression model. I'm a stats wizard, so I love this kind of stuff. But just to break it down in a very simple, digestible way, we can predict where you sit in terms of business satisfaction even before we've started to measure business satisfaction, using some of those weightings that we've discovered. So project delivery, how good you are with the relationship piece, all of these things carry a certain weight. And we find that our model performs pretty good. Around 93.1% of the scores fall within plus or minus 5%. So looking at these key takeaways, so if you don't want to look internally, you can look across the industry, but we're doing something right. We're starting to get the right pulse on what the stakeholders care about. But again, we do suggest looking internally to actually figure out what matters for you as a city or you as a county or state agency. Okay, so here we are. We know that business satisfaction sits at around 7.3. We need to measure this, look internally. Well, how do we actually apply this knowledge? And I'll have you just imagine that you're no longer in your roles, which may be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on whether you like your role or not. And I'll have you imagine you're the CIO or a recruiter, and you're faced with a challenge. You've lost your IT manager, you've lost your CIO, and now you need to go out on the market and hire someone who's going to bring in this kind of level of innovation where they want to increase business satisfaction. And you're presented with 3 resumes. One is Balance Bill from Blue Bus Corporation. He was CIO there, now looking for a job at your local city. And his philosophy is every process is as equally important as the others. So he's going to focus on the whole gamut as a CIO. That's his strategy. Secondly, we have Trendy Tony. He's going to invest heavily in things like innovation, infrastructure, and he's really following the trend and keeping a pulse on that. That's his big focus. Then we have Cautious Carla, who says, I don't know what my priorities will be, depends what matters, and where we can make an impact. And you have to pick, based on these resumes, who's going to drive the greatest amount of business satisfaction. Now, unfortunately, we at Infotech aren't very good at hiding the right answer, so I'm guessing most of you know who's going to win throughout the three, but let's walk through the exercise anyways. So currently, in terms of a baseline, looking at just averaging across three core services, we're sitting around 63% in terms of stakeholder satisfaction. Now let's see how these three did at the end of the year. Balanced Bill focused on everything equally, boiled the ocean a little bit, and saw an increase in points across those 6 areas. So he did pretty good, all things considered. It's hard to find an increase across all 6 areas of IT. Trendy Tony, as I mentioned, focused more in infrastructure and innovation. Didn't really look at the rest, saw large point increase in those 2 areas. Cautious Carla, though, surprise, surprise, looked at the data, found out that project management and relationships were the biggest drivers of stakeholder satisfaction in her city, county, or state. And looking across the scores, she had an increase of 8 points, which year over year is very good. You know, an increase in 3 points is good, but she also didn't burn the candle at both ends. She didn't try to fix all of the core processes. She didn't invest in all of the projects equally. She aligned herself with the stakeholders to figure out what the stakeholders wanted the most. So she worked less, or focused on less, and had the greatest amount of dividends relative to her peers. And it's one thing to give you a toy example, it's another one to give a real world example. Ken Platt has been with us since the onset of the diagnostic program, and his company was hit pretty hard by the recession. He's the CTO for a company called Learning Resources. It's a luxury toy company that manufactures and develops toys for early cognitive development and the disabled children who they're marketed towards. And he was hit hard by the recession. The stakeholders are putting a lot of pressure on him to regain some of the business. And to make matters worse, there's a new CFO who's coming in who he needs to build a relationship with. So we convinced him to look at the data. He was reluctant to do so because you can imagine if you've been in your organization 5, 10, 20 years and the results don't look great on you, that's a conversation and a pill that's going to be a bit hard to swallow. But we convinced them that knowing would be better than not knowing, and at least you can now have a benchmark and start to align your services to the stakeholders. This was his scorecard when we started off. The overall satisfaction score, not amazing. Most of the stakeholders either weren't happy with IT, as you can see by the red man count. Only 3 out of 10 were satisfied with IT's offerings. Relationships weren't great. But now Ken had a common communication platform. So we could at least bring this report to the stakeholders to have a meaningful conversation to figure out where the sore spots are and how he's going to address them. And looking at the project side, Ken was really good with IT policies. That was his #1 in terms of satisfaction, 70%. Unfortunately, he was really good at something that the stakeholders didn't care about. It's 12 out of 12. The stakeholders don't care about security policies. So we worked with Ken over a series of 5 years, and after the end of the 5 years, his scores, as you would imagine, went up because he was able to have a meaningful conversation with them. He asked them questions surrounding client-facing technology, as an example. And he asked them previously, why was I docked so hard in that area? And it turns out that it was for the website, which wasn't even owned by Ken. It was owned by marketing. It was an e-commerce platform. So he was getting a bad rap for something he didn't even own. So he was able to ask these questions and have this meaningful conversation and speak using something that the stakeholders understand, which is numbers, percentages, and colors. I think everyone in this room can get on board with that's something that you can digest and, and understand. And his progress was steady. Over the 4 years that we worked with him, he actually outperformed our very simple linear regression model, where compared to the balance improvement, if he would have done the boil the ocean strategy, he yielded much greater dividends compared to addressing all of the core services equally, as opposed to just focusing on what the stakeholders cared about most. Okay, so 7.3 is the average. Business satisfaction is our key metric to rule them all. And you want to look internally to figure out where you sit in terms of what projects matter most to your stakeholders. So now you have your roadmap, you know what you need to do, but how do you actually get there? Well, one thing you need to do is you need to look internally at your IT team's capabilities. So we've partnered with ISACCA, and we've adapted the COBIT 5 model, which includes things like ITIL v4 and NIST and ISO 27001 and all the fan favorites. And we look across these 45 key areas, and we ask 3 simple questions to the IT leadership. How important do you think this process is to your team? How effective is this process to your team? And the fun one, who's accountable for this process? And in doing so, we see this kind of trend in the data, and colors are going to shift here, but long story short, the red areas are areas that were high in importance, so everyone agreed this is something that's important to the team, but areas where we're low in effectiveness. And usually this comes back as a sea of red because people in IT tend to think that every core process is important. So we have to do a little bit of refinement in terms of what matters to the stakeholders, and we try to distill it to 5 or 6 key areas that you can manage. So instead of boiling the ocean, figure out the 6 top things that are going to drive stakeholder satisfaction. And then we're going to look at the accountability piece to figure out why this area may have turned red. And we'll see 2 things typically here. One is there's too many people who raised their hands and said, I'm accountable for service desk. So it's a bit like a LA traffic jam in that one little box. Way too many names, diffusion of responsibility. The other is a bit like a desert effect, where no one said they're responsible for that area. So surprise, surprise, it's an area that you're not going to be effective in because no one's responsible for it. And your data is going to help dictate what matters. It's really going to cut through the noise, and it's your objective friend. So we recommend using it. And this is just a rolled up view. And again, going back to that tower, we're at level 1 right now. This is a rolled up view of projects as a function of their ease of implementation and how much they correlate with business satisfaction. So the projects in the top right are quick wins, bottom left are time sinks. So this is a project view for an unstable organization. And you can see that as you go up this ladder, these pieces are going to move around quite a bit, all the way up to the the highest level of maturity, which is our innovative leader. Now, I'm not showing you this to overwhelm you. Well, it's partially the reason I'm showing it is to overwhelm you, but that's part of the point that I'm trying to make, which is imagine trying to figure out which one of those quadrants a project goes in without using data, and how that's going to change year over year. A lot of you have likely contributed or published an IT strategy within the last few years. Imagine trying to figure out, with all the external factors and all the internal factors to your IT departments, which one of these quadrants a project should fit in. It's not to say it's impossible, but it's very hard. So we recommend use that data to your advantage and guide your IT strategy using data, as opposed to just hunches or guesswork. And when you do this, you can start to build out meaningful key initiatives. So here's just a sample one for security. These are the top 9 initiatives that we found drove the most business satisfaction for your CISOs and ISOs out there. But it's all built out of data. These are things we know on average drive business satisfaction, and you can craft your own by looking at your data internally as well. All right, last slide, final point. We find that organizations that try to get a pulse on business satisfaction start to dramatically outperform your peers. So looking at the first band over here, most organizations who aren't measuring business satisfaction are at that 73, 74%, and it's not changing year over year because they're trying to shoot at a moving target. For the organizations that are measuring this formally and getting a benchmark and figuring out what projects matter most, they're the ones seeing that's 5 to 7% year over year improvements. So it's slow and gradual, but it's there, and it's better than not measuring it all. And this isn't a sales pitch to say, do this Infotex way. You all have the ability to collect this data on your own and do the same thing. It's just saying, use your data and use it wisely. So 3 key take-homes. Business satisfaction is our metric to get into the World Series of IT baseball. Continuously measure and look internally to make sure you can actually support what matters most to your stakeholders. And I thank you for your time. I'm happy to share the presentation with whoever wants it. It's open source that way, and I'm happy to take any questions, or I'm at the booth if you'd like to chat further.